Hi, gang. Number one Marmaduke fan here, and we're looking at the Campfire Classics graphic novel adaptation of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Apparently, these were sold in Hannibal, Missouri, the hometown of Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain. I love Tom Sawyer. I read and reread Tom Sawyer as a kid, and I was kind of formally introduced to Huckleberry Finn in high school when everyone had to read it, and I kind of see Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn should almost be treated as like a single novel rather than like people when they split them in half and say Huck Finn is the great novel in American literature and Tom Sawyer is just like the prequel to it. If you look at them together, it's all about boyhood adventure and Mark Twain doing one of the most serious and thoughtful critiques of the institution slavery possible through a narrative format. And what's ironic about it is he kind of had a self-deprecating attitude towards his own writing style. His comment about Huckleberry Finn printed at the front kind of illustrates this. Persons attempting to find a motive in this narrative will be prosecuted. Persons attempting to find a moral in it will be banished. Persons attempting to find a plot in it will be shot. The other book by Mark Twain you should read, in addition to these classics, I think, is Pudd'nhead Wilson, because Pudd'nhead Wilson came towards the end of his life, and if you compare Pudd'nhead Wilson to Tom Sawyer, you can kind of see how Mark Twain became more pessimistic in his later life, where he always had this great, really wry sense of humor. And I think in his old age, and because of the death of his family, he became more and more bitter. He became more and more pessimistic about American culture. And there's a little bit of that journey from Tom Sawyer, which is a very optimistic, uplifting view at the life of young American boys, into Huck Finn, where you start to see some of the ugliness and the lies and the manipulation of some people in American culture. The other thing maybe to remark about Mark Twain is his writing style. You've got to read the preface to Pudd'nhead Wilson. It's one of the most interesting things that I've ever read on the topic of writing, because what he pretty much admitted is he would make stuff up as he went. He might have a couple scenes in mind at the beginning, and then he would just start writing, which means that there would be sometimes plot contrivances or crazy things would happen. And yet, because he's such a good writer, it's sort of like he's able to make it work while not even being sure what he's doing. And it adds a little wry humor to it all. And I think his perspective on children kind of connects to that. The most interesting information comes from children, where they tell all they know and then stop. So a Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, Pudd'nhead Wilson plot is things start happening, things keep happening, things escalate, and then everything stops, almost surprisingly. So, Campfire Classics, these adaptations, these are not the only adaptations of these classic stories. They, on the back, say, how could we have made this book better? So, that means they want brutally honest critique. So, there are two different artists for these books. The artist for Tom Sawyer needs to up their game. So, let's see here. The cover illustrator is Naresh Kumar. The illustrator is Brian Shearer. And the colors and the lettering need to borrow more, obviously, from comics history. If you're going to dip your foot into the graphic novel world, you need to understand graphic novels enough to make them actually look like what kids like. So some tells of that are they use like Comic Sans lettering. They don't use the all caps format. The reason comics have historically used the all caps format is it's dynamic. It's really easy for little kids to read because they recognize their capital letters. And it forces you to be really economical with your language because the bigger letters, you have less space to work with. The art has some solid construction, some solid expressions, but it doesn't have a lot of fluidity, and it has a lot of problem matching up characters with their environment. So I eventually just kind of like gave up on it. I couldn't make myself read it anymore, even though I like the story of Tom Sawyer, and I dipped out. Color-wise, I think it's using a painterly color style with a simple line work style, and those don't blend together too well. So Tom Sawyer is a really weak adaptation of the Tom Sawyer story. A better one is the 1950s Classics Illustrated edition, which pretty much addressed all the things I mentioned. Kind of an odd cartoony style of the 1950s era, but a comic booky style, simple coloring, and Classics Illustrated has done some weird stuff with the lettering, where they updated the lettering for the new editions, but at least for both of them, like the old style was a little bit more, beautiful and lyrical and kind of illustrated handwriting style, and the new versions are kind of like the typical like comic book, typed on a computer style. But both of them are nice and legible and kind of fit better with the lettering history of comics. So that's my review of Tom Sawyer. Weak book, not my favorite adaptation of the Tom Sawyer story. Huck Finn, the artist for this, is a much better example of what I'm talking about, and this actually is my favorite adaptation of the Huckleberry Finn story in comics. So for this, the illustrator is Naresh Kumar, and the colorist is Prince Varghese, and both of them use a loose storybook illustration style with kind of broad charcoal strokes, and then a loose impressionist painting style. And those two things actually work together as teammates much, much better. And then for the cover artist, there's Naresh Kumar and Vijay Sharma. I'm not really sure what the collaboration is. This is not a good cover illustration, I think. Huck looks a little wonky. He doesn't look like he does in the book. It's not the most dynamic scene. This is a better attention grabber for a cover. They're about to get run over by a giant ship on their little raft, and they're diving off. You want an action scene to sell it as a comic for kids. So I'm just going to show you maybe like a few examples. So, okay, good thing number one is they show you all the characters at the beginning with their names, so you can kind of have a mental read on them. This actually isn't even my favorite drawing in the whole book, because I think the boys look a little, I don't know, they look a little stockier than they do in the book. But you can see how, there's loose, sketch work and shading work around here. There's lots of cool little details in the caves and the grass to give it a little texture, but it's not minutely detailed, but it feels detailed, just like some smart use of detail. Using details smartly can create a really deep look without, while saving you maybe like a few hundred hours of meticulously drawing every little dot and blade of grass. It's about using your eye to make sure there's a balance of detail throughout everything. And there's a lot more dynamic, up and down angles and panels, doing some interesting things. Gutters, they just go with like a simple white gutter around it, and that's okay. They kind of eschewed the black border around it, but they still gave me some white, so my eye had a break. And it's the Huck Finn story. So the Huckleberry Finn story is great. Therefore, this comic story is going to be great. I won't belabor that, but, like Jim, he's younger than I thought he was, because Huck used to call him Old Jim. But Jim in this looks to be like about 30 or 40, and he has a lot of humanity. I think the story of Huckleberry Finn, it's all about adventure, while the adventure, the theme of slavery is an underlying thing throughout, which complements the adventure that Huck goes on with Jim. So if Tom Sawyer is all about Huck and Tom getting into trouble and being, boyish lads who want adventure, and then they get in trouble with Injun Joe, Huck Finn is building on that, because Huck Finn has always had this sort of boyish, childish view of life. And then he's thrust into an adventure where he's constantly in danger. They don't really have a good plan. They're not even going north. They're going south. And the plan is so stupid it actually gets them out of trouble sometimes, because someone can say, is that a runaway slave? And Huck will say, no, why would a slave run south? And then you say, okay. And bad things happen to them, and they just have to try to keep up with it. And they fly by the seat of their pants. It really underscores maybe kind of like the immaturity of Tom Sawyer. It's really beautiful. So Tom Sawyer is a civilized boy who wants adventure. And so Huck Finn, this poor redneck boy, gets to be Tom's vehicle to getting adventure in Tom Sawyer. In Huck Finn, it starts off with them, going on their boyish adventures, and then Huck gets in trouble and has to go on the run with Jim. And then when he meets Tom again, it's clear that Tom has not grown as much as Huck has. And even though Tom and Jim both kind of respect Tom, they believe that Tom is, the man with the plan. What becomes clear is that Tom just thinks about escaping with Jim as another adventure. He doesn't think about it as this is real life, as opposed to my imagination. This actually affects Jim's life. I'm going to come up with some crazy plan, like I read out of a storybook, to help Jim. And then, like I said, because Mark Twain kind of made things up as he went along, then everything kind of comes to a head and it just stops. And you're kind of surprised by how sudden the stop is. There isn't like a big emotional moment where, actually there are emotional moments. One of the things they left out that I think is actually kind of tragic they left this out is when Huck played a prank on Jim by putting a snake in his sleeping bag and nearly killed Jim. And Huck kind of had to come to terms with the fact that he hadn't been treating Jim like a friend, that he hadn't been treating Jim like a human. And they left out probably one of the most important scenes, which is Huck believing that by helping Jim escape, he's damning himself to hell because he's ignorant about Christianity and the Bible. And in his own ignorant way, Huck Finn says, well, then I will go to hell if helping Jim means I go to hell, then I will go to hell, which is a true moment of heroes. It's a tragic moment because he's actually doing the right thing. He's doing what God would have him to do in that situation. But because he's ignorant, he doesn't understand the full implications of what he's doing. So, yeah, I mean, they had to abridge things, they had to leave some things out, but it's a real fun rush, really, really sweet illustration style throughout. It's my favorite comic book adaptation of Huckleberry Finn so far. That's 10 minutes? All right, so Tom Sawyer's getting donated. I'm keeping Huckleberry Finn because it's my favorite adaptation so far. The Campfire Classics, they've got a whole bunch, and some of them look nicely illustrated. So I will be taking a peek at the Campfire Classics because I do love comic adaptations of classic stories. I like seeing what they leave out. I like seeing what they emphasize. I like seeing if they distinguish themselves from Classics Illustrated in some way, and this is an excellent example. That's it. Like, comment, subscribe, click the bell to receive notifications. I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys, and I'll catch you later.